Good afternoon. Hope all of you are doing well. Today we're learning Maseches Yevamos Daf Kuf Dalet, and we're starting a little bit more than halfway down on Kuf Gimel Amud Beis at the two dots. The Gemara says, in regards to the line of Amar Rav Papa, the Gemara says as follows: Amar Rav Papi Mishmei de Rava Sandal Hamuskar. Let's say that you have a shoe that you'd like to use for chalitza. The problem is that it's muskar. It's quarantined as it relates to the possibility of it having a negat saras. So what's the halacha? Lo tachalotz bo. It's not appropriate that one should do chalitza with that kind of shoe. V'im chaltza. But if in fact they did a chalitza kshera, the halacha would be that the chalitza is valid. So it's not ideal, not lechatchila, but b'diavad it's kosher. What about sandal hamuchlat? Not something that we have a suffix about its negat status. It has a real nega and it's 100% sure. It's not muskar in quarantine, but it's muchlat. So then the din is different. Lo tachlotz bo. One should not do chalitza. But there, that's true both lechatchila and b'diavad. V'im chaltza chalitza so psula. And the reason why the chalitza would be psula with a sandal that is muchlat, that it definitely has a nega, is because of a principle called kitute michsas shiure. The halacha is that when we have something that we know that needs to be destroyed, we treat it as though it's been destroyed already. And since that's the case, it's as if there's no shoe here, and therefore the chalitza is not kosher. That's a shita of Rav Papi. However, Rav Papa Mishmei de Rava, he argues and he says, Amar echad sandal hamuskar echad sandal hamuchlat lo tachlotz bo. It doesn't make a difference if the shoe is besafik of a nega and it's only been put into quarantine, or it's a vadai that it has a nega saras. Halacha is lo tachlotz bo v'im chaltza chalitza kshera, that there is a din lechatchila that we should not use these shoes. However, b'diavad it would be kosher. Meisvei, the Gemara asks a question on one of these shitas. Let's see which one. We have a din beis hamuskar. If you have a house that's subject to quarantine, metame mitocho, anything on the inside can cause tumah. Muchlat, if it's not muskar, but it's muchlat, if in fact it definitely has a negat saras, mitocho umeachara, both inside and outside of the house. V'zeh v'zeh metamen bibia. And both of them, the muskar and the muchlat, would generate tumah for a person or any items that would be brought into the house. V'ik sal kadaitach ke dummy. And if you want to say, this is a question now we know on the shita of Rav Papi, because Rav Papi was of the opinion that there was a principle of michtas shiure, that it was as if the shoe was already destroyed. So if you want to say, v'sal kadaitach ke michtas dummy, and if that's true, then the house doesn't exist because it's michtas shiur. How can you say that there's any tumah? Says the Gemara, shiny hasam damar krav v'nitatz es habayis afilu b'shas netitza karui bayis. You're right, the principle should be michtas shiur, and Rav Papi still has what to stand on. However, over here, because of the text of the pasuk, we therefore do view the house as tameh, even before it is destroyed. Although really, without that pasuk, we would have fallen back on our regular rules of kitute michtas shiure, that it's as if it has been burned down already. Tashma, let's ask another question. Matzlis, there's a small piece of cloth. It says the Gemara, sheyesh bo shalosh al shalosh. It's very small. It's 3 by 3 etzbos. And afal pi she'ein bo kizayis. Even though the volume of this fabric is not a kizayis, kevan shenichnas ruba lebeis tahor, since at least half of it, 51% of this, will have entered the threshold of a house where we consider it to be the possibility of it having saras, referred to here as a beis tahor, timatuhu, it would be considered tameh. Says the Gemara, my lav muchletes. Doesn't that seem to be that we're talking about a house that's muchletes, where it's vadai that there's tzaras here, and we see that we don't treat it as kitute mechtas shiure, kasha and Rav Papi? Says the Gemara, no, not necessarily, because maybe this case is talking about musgeras. It's only talking about a case that's in quarantine. Says the Gemara, if that's true, then ema seifa, then I have a problem from the seifa. If you're assuming that the Reisha is talking about muskeras, a case of quarantine, how then do we understand the seifa? What does the seifa say? The seifa says, hayukama zeisim, if there were many units of zeisim in regards to this cloth, so then kevan shenichnas mimenu kizayis, the beis tahor, if a kizayis worth of that fabric enters into a house where there might be tzaras timatu, then it would be tameh. Now, if you want to tell me that the seifa is talking about a case of muchletes, and therefore the seifa would be as well, then we understand, hainu de iskash lemeis, we compare the levels of tumah of this beged in the same way that we would compare something that would become tameh meis, because it's a muchlet, it's definite that there's tzaras. Elai amras muskeras, if what we're saying is that this mishnah, this brisa, is talking about a case of quarantine and not talking about a case of definite tzaras, so then amai iskash lemeis, then there's no reason to have made a full comparison between the tuma of this house, b'muskeras, and a case of a mace. And therefore, says the Gemara, great question. So, shiny hasam, the reason why over there we do view it that way is Amar Krav Sarafes HaBeged, Afil B'Shas Sreifa Karui Beged. Says the Gemara, it's a unique din over there based on the pasuk. Again, similar structure of an answer to the previous answer, which is that the pasuk allows us to live in two worlds. Yes, the principle is michtas kitute michtas shiur, that really it should be the case that these things should be destroyed. But here we have a pasuk that overrides that principle. Says the Gemara v'ligmar minei. Maybe we should be able to learn from over here that in regards to chalitza, one should be able to use one of these shoes, also a kasha and Rav Papa, because he was limiting against that. Says the Gemara, iser mituma lo gamrina. These are two different areas. We have Isser v'Heter and Tuma v'Tara. So sometimes you can extrapolate from one to the other. But here the Gemara says, seemingly as a golden rule, that we don't learn Isurim. We don't learn Isser v'Heter from Tuma v'Tara. The worlds are too different and therefore incomparable. Says the Gemara, Omar Rava, how do we paskin? Hilchasa, the halacha is that Echad Sandal Hamuskar, Echad Sandal Shemuchla, if you have a sandal, you have a shoe that is in quarantine because it may have tzaras, or ve'echad sandal shemuchla, you have a shoe that definitely has tzaras, or adding something new that we haven't yet learned about in regards to chalitza, ve'echad sandal shel avodas kochavim, a shoe that was used in some elements of avodas kochavim, lo tachlots, you should not use those shoes. However, v'im chalza chalitza sakshir b'di'eved, you are allowed to use those items against the shita of Rav Papi, paskening like Rav Papa with an aleph. Says the Gemara, Shelti Kroves Avodas Kochavim. What if the actual shoe was part and parcel of the Avodas Kochavim, or top of Kuf Dal Ramadal V'Shel Ir Hanidachas, a city that needs to be destroyed, or V'Shel Zakin Ha'asu Lechvodo. And Rashi says over here that we're talking about shoes that were made for a mace, Tachrichin, they were made for someone to be laid to rest in them, Lo Tachlot. In all of these cases, one should not do chalitza with a shoe like this. V'im Chalza Chalitza Subsula. However, if they did, the halacha is that there would be pasal even b'di'eved. Omerli Ravina the Ravashi, Ravina asks a kasha. Ma'ishna zakin ha'asur l'chvodo delav lehilucha avid. Why is it that you restricted the shoe that was made for the zakin as tachrichin? There, the reason why we're not allowed to use it seemingly is because it was a shoe that was never meant for walking. Dead people don't walk, so he's going to be buried in the shoe. Nothing to talk about. He's never going to walk with it. So says the Gemara, the beidina nami lav lehilucha avid. If you make a shoe specifically for chalitza, nobody's walking in that shoe. It's only used for chalitza. Says the Gemara, it may be true that in general it's not used that way. Amar he responded, Ilu maske be'shlucha de beidina. If in fact somebody put on the shoe, there's nothing wrong with putting on the chalitza shoe. It might not look normal, but there's nothing wrong with wearing it. Mi kapita ledaina. No one in Bezdin is going to care if he wears the shoe or doesn't. Halachically, it may have been cumbersome to make, and therefore we want to save the shoe for something. But there's no halachic issue with him. So therefore, the Gemara says that there is a big distinction between the two shoes. The shoe of the zakin will never be walked in, and the shoe of the chalitza could be walked in. That brings us to a new Mishnah, Kuf Daled Amud Aleph, 10 lines down. Chalta b'layla. What if a person does chalitza at night? Or then the halacha is chalitza sakshir. The chalitza would count if it's done at night. Rabbi Lazar Posel, he doesn't agree. If it's done at night, it's pasul. Bismol, if a person does chalitza on the left, chalitza sapsula, the din is that it would be pasul. But Rabbi Lazar machshir. Rabbi Lazar is of the opinion that if you do it on the left foot, he would say it's okay. Asks the Gemara, Leima beha kamiflage. Maybe the machlokas in our Mishnah is about the following: the marsavar makshinan ribim lenegoyim. Ribim, a riv in the Torah is a financial dispute, a financial spat. So maybe we should compare ribim lenegoyim. Umar savar lo makshinan ribim lenegoyim. And one says that we don't compare the two. Says the Gemara lo. Dekule alma lo makshin and ribim lenegoyim. Everyone agrees we don't compare financial disputes to negoyim. The makshinan, if in fact we would have compared that, then afilu gmardin balayla namilo. There is a halacha that by the tchilas gmardin you're allowed to do during the day, and if you started with the tchilas gmardin during the day, you can do the gmardin at night. But if we make a comparison to looking at negoyim, you could never look at a nega at night, and that would have had a false implication that maybe even the gmardin cannot be learned at night. Gmardin balayla namilo. So therefore, the machlokas in our Mishnah about chalza balayla is not rooted in whether or not we say ribim lenegoyim are compared to one another, because they're definitely not. Really, here's what the machlokas is about. Mar savar chalitza kitchilas din damya. One shita holds that chalitza is like the beginning of the din of a riv, of a financial spat, and there the halacha is that if you do start the din Torah during the day, you can finish it at night, and therefore that would be the sheet in our Mishnah that chalitza balayla chalitza sekshera. Mar savar chalitza kigmar din damya. Mar savar no, it's only like a gemar din. Okay, so that's the machlokas. Says the Gemara, a third of the way down. Rabbi Barchia ketosfa. Avad uvda bimok uviyechidi uvalayla. He did a case of chalitza that had a trifecta of problems. It was bimok, the shoe was made out of felt. It was biyechidi, it was without a bezin, and it was balayla, it was at night. We just saw there was a machlokas at night about this. Amar Shmuel, kama rav guvre da avikiyechida. What kind of great rabbi would do something like this? B'kiyechida, like all one shita. That doesn't make sense. We know, we've already learned the Mishnah that discussed the machlokas tanaim. Do we say that it needs 3 dayanim or 5? But we never entertain the possibility that it only needs 1. Says the Gemara, my kashya, what was difficult for Shmuel to understand about this line? Says the Gemara, imok stamatanya. If you're talking about the fact that the shoe is made out of felt, there we have a stam Mishnah. Ilaila, if you're concerned about laila stamatanya, look at our Mishnah. We see that according to some, that chalza balayla chalitza sekshera. Ella, says the Gemara, what Shmuel was bothered by was yechidi kakashile. And hachi avi biyechidi diyechidak tanila. We have a Mishnah that does speak about doing this as an individual. However, it's rejected. What does the Mishnah say? It's not. Let's say you use 2 or 3 witnesses for chalitza, and it turns out after the fact that they are not valid witnesses. The halacha is chalitza psula. Reb Shimon, Reb Yochanan, Asanlar machshir. These shitas of Reb Shimon and Reb Yochanan, Asanlar, they say that b'di'eved, that this is a kosher chalitza. What does that show you? That even with a yachid, the din is that the chalitza still works. And umaisa, and we're going to see this Mishnah on the top of the next page. Umaisa be'echad shechalatz beino leveina beveis v'asrim. Let's say that there's 2 people living in jail together, a man and a woman, and they have to do chalitza. Let's say Reuven was married to Rachel. Reuven died. Rachel's in prison with Shimon, and Shimon is Reuven's brother. So the din is that if they do chalitza with one person, so then, if they do chalitza with one person, then you would be able to call that to be kosher. That's what we seem to say. And how do we know that it was kosher? It says the Gemara, Rabbi Akiva was matir in such a case to say that one is in fact allowed to use only one aid as it relates to chalitza. Amar Rav Yosef Bar Min Yumi, Amar Rav Nachman, Ein halacha k'oso azuv. And the Gemara says, we don't paskin like that. We don't paskin the kula when it comes to chalitza as it relates to dayanim. And therefore, we cannot assume that yechidi is mutter. So what's going on in the Gemara? The Ibai Sema, there's another possibility as to how this din was set up in the name of Rabbi Barchia Ketosva, where he did allow this to be done with one person. All of the das yechidim were mentioned in a brisa. The Tanya, the brisa writes, Amar Rabbi Shmuel Rabbi Yossi, Ani Reisias Rabbi Shmuel ben Elisha shechalatz b'mok b'yechidi v'alayla. We have a brisa that's explicit that speaks about this case. So what we see from here is that these das yechidim, in regards to mok, in regards to yechidi, in regards to layla, are found in a brisa. Very good. That brings us to the 2 dots, 3 lines before the wide lines on Kuf Dal and Amud Aleph. Let's continue. We had said in our Mishnah that there's a machlokas bismol chalitza, so that there's a machlokas my time at the Rabbanan. What's the reason of the Rabbanan to say that bismol is psula? Why is it that you cannot do chalitza on the left? Says the Gemara, Amar Ula Yalfinan Regel mi Mitzorah. We learn from Mitzorah, and we have a Gzera Shava. Malahalan diyamin, Afkan diyamin. And over there by Mitzorah, we have to be mitahir him with the right. And so to over here, we have to be mitahir. We have to also do chalitza on the right. I have Rebbe Lazar lo yalif regel mi Mitzorah. Rebbe Lazar just ignores Gzera Shava. You can't do that. Says the Gemara, V'atanya Rebbe Lazar Ami minayin l'ritzia shehi be'ozen hayamanis. We know the din in the Torah v'ratzas es ozno ba'martzeva avado leolam, that if there's an eved who wants to become a permanent eved, so the halacha is that we have to do ritzia on his ozen, and that's always done on the right ear. Ne'amar kan ozen v'ne'amar lahalan ozen. Ma lahalan yamin avkan yamin. So we see that he does have this exact type of gzera shava. So Rebbe Lazar can't just ignore this din. Amar Rav Yitzchak Bar Yosef, Amar Rav Yochanan muchlefes hashita. That's not, the brisa had to be flipped. Really, Rabbi Lazar doesn't hold of this idea. And Rava Amar lo olam lo tepuch, really, where there really is a machlokes, but it's a machlokes that we thought of originally. He does not like the gzera shava of regel. Why not? Because we've learned about this before. There are different types of gzera shavas. A gzera shava, where both of the words are fully available for the gzera shava, referred to as a gzera shava mufne. So that's an impenetrable gzera shava, and no questions that you ask about differences between the 2 sides can debunk the actual gzera shava. Masha'en kain, if it's a gzera shava she'ena mufne, if it has at least one, and certainly both of the words are really used for other things, And in an ancillary form, we have another Gzeira Shava. So there, as long as you come up with a good kasha, you can debunk. And it's a house of cards at that point. You can ruin the whole Gzeira Shava. So it says the Gemara, 5 lines from the bottom. Ozen mufni, the Gzeira Shava of Ozen, where we can learn about the ritzia of the ear of a person. So says the Gemara, that's mufni. Those words are fully available. However, regel lo mufni. But when it comes to the Gzeira Shava that the Tanakama wanted to recommend, of regel to teach us that just like by Mitzorah it's on the Yamin, so too over here by Chalitza it's on the Yamin. Rabbi Lazar doesn't want to embrace that because he says that's lo mufni. He says that's a Gzeira Shava to lo mufni. It's not an ideal Gzeira Shava, and with one good question, the house of cards will topple. So says the Gemara, V'chilo mufni mai pircha. If in fact the Gzeira Shava is not a balanced Gzeira Shava, and really the words of the Gzeira Shava, of regel, are not fully available, then what question are you asking to debunk? Says the Gemara, very simple. There are a lot of chidushim by Mitzorah that don't apply to Chalitza, and therefore Rabbi Lazar was bothered. He said, you cannot make that Gzeira Shava here because I can reject it. The Gemara doesn't deal with this, but really the kash is back on the Tanakama. Why are you not nervous about the mufna factor? Because if there in fact the Gzeira Shava is not an ideal Gzeira Shava, then there are definitely questions to be asked. New Mishnah on the bottom of Kuf Daled Amud Aleph. There are a number of features that are required to perform Chalitza properly. And says the Gemara, what if you only do some of them? And here are the different permutations. Chalza urekaka avalo kira. Let's say that the Chalitza was done, she took off the shoe, urekaka, and she spit on the floor per the pasuk in Chumash avalo kira. She didn't read the requisite reading in Chumash. Chalitza sakshera, we see that the kriya is not le'ikuva, and halacha l'maisa the Chalitza works. Kira urekaka. What if she did read the requisite psukim urekaka and she spit on the ground about chalza and she didn't remove the shoe? That chalitza sapsula. I can just say there's any chalitza without actually doing chalitza, of course. And 2 lines from the bottom, the Mishnah then says a third iteration, a third permutation, but this time there's a machlokas. Chalza ukira. Let's say that she actually did the requisite chalitza and reading of a lo rekaka, but she didn't spit on the ground per the psukim. That's a machlokas tanaim. Rabbi Lazar omer chalitza sapsula. The halacha is according to Rabbi Lazar that the chalitza doesn't work, and the rekaka, the spitting, is actually le'ikuva. However, Rabbi Kiva omer chalitza sakshir. That brings us to the top of Kuf Dalet Amud Beis. Says the Gemara, continuing in the Mishnah, Amar le Rabbi Lazar, it says kacha ye'aseh kol davar shu ma'aseh me'akeh. He learns based on the pasuk where it says kacha ye'aseh. This is what you should do. That if you have a ma'aseh that you need to do, something a pe'ula you need to do, and you don't do it, then it should be le'ikuva. And that's why he says that the rekak has to be done properly. It says Rabbi Akiva, not correct. Amar le Rabbi Akiva, mishon raya kacha ye'aseh li'ish l'chol davar shu ma'aseh be'ish. Only things that you're actually doing to that person, to the man, which is the actual removal of the shoe. That's le'ikuva, but nothing else is le'ikuva. The rekaka, the spitting on the ground, is not actually done to the man. That's a misnomer. Sometimes people think that is the case. That's not how the chalitza is done. And therefore, the din is that it would not be le'ikuva according to Rabbi Akiva. Says the Gemara, 4 lines down on Kuf Daled Amud Beis, we're still in the midst of the Mishnah. HaCheresh shenechlatz. Let's say that the recipient of chalitza, the man, is a cheresh, he's a deaf mute, and he had the chalitza done, v'hacharashes, and a woman who is a deaf mute, shechalza v'choletzes katan, and she does chalitza, or there is a girl, or a chalitza is done to a katan, chalitza sapsula, the din is that the chalitza doesn't count. Tana shechalta, let's just clarify. The choletzes katan is that a katan had his shoe removed, and chalitza sapsula. Tana shechalta, if you have a girl who does chalitza, tachlos mishatagdil, she really does need to do a new chalitza when she's older. V'im lo chalta chalitza sapsula, but if she doesn't, then the halacha is that the chalitza doesn't count. Really, her chalitza as a katana really doesn't help at all. It continues the Mishnah. This is exactly the quote we saw on the previous page. Chalza b'shnayim o b'shlosh avnim ze'echem and karbo pasal chalitza sapsula. That if there are 2 or 3 witnesses for chalitza and they turn out to be pasal, then the chalitza was a 0. Rabbi Shimon and Rabbi Yochanan Asan are machshirin, that they say that's not correct. We even allow for 1 aid to work for chalitza. In the case we learned already, where Rachel, who was married to Ruvain, and Ruvain died, and now Rachel and Shimon are in a prison cell together. It's just the 2 of them, no witnesses, and they do chalitza. So the Gemara says that would be considered a valid chalitza. The Gemara opens a quarter of the way down, Kuf Daled Amud Beis. We're going to be going to the second to last line, and then we'll be stopping and picking up again tomorrow for another pre-recorded and posted shiur. Let's open up with the Gemara. Amar Rava. Rava says, Hashata Amris, Kriya lo me'akva. Once you say that reading the psukim are not le'ikuva, that it doesn't uproot the quality of the chalitza. Lefichach, if that's true, then ilaim ve'ilemes shechaltzu chalitzas and kshera. Then, if you have an elaim and you have someone who doesn't know how to speak, male or female, so then the din is it should be a kosher chalitza because the kriya is not leikuva. Says the Gemara, hang on 1 second, let's see if that's really true. Does it stand up to the test of questioning? Tanan, that's our Mishnah. That if you have these cases, a cheresh is a deaf mute, so the halacha is that it's puzzle. My timer, lav mishum de lav b'nei kriyaninu. Isn't that because these people can't read? Says the Gemara, no, that's not why. It's not because they can't read. It's because they're not b'nei de'ah. Lo mishum de lav b'nei de'aninu. Says the Gemara, hachi ilem ve'ilemes. If you have someone who just can't speak, but they're perfectly brilliant, there are people who just don't know how to communicate. Amar Rava, ilem ve'ilemes b'nei de'aninu. People who are elaim, there's someone who's a mute, but they're perfectly bright, so they have das. It's just that they have a problem with their mouth. They can't talk, so they can't talk. Right? Let's say they have laryngitis or their muscles in their mouth don't work, whatever the case may be, but they're not considered people who are not b'nei das. Hold on 1 second, but if they can't speak, so then the pasuk says Omar and Omra, so then they have to be able to speak. So therefore, we have a misunderstanding of what Rava's comment was at the open of the Gemara. So let's try again. Elaki idmar de Rava, when Rava made his memra, his statement, the one that we opened with in this section of Gemara, it must have been a seif idmar on the end of the Mishnah. What is the case of the end of the Mishnah? We had said that if there is a deaf mute, male or female, yes, or if there was a choletzes min akatan, if the recipient of the chalitza was a young boy under bar mitzvah, the halacha is that chalitzas is psula. And Amar Rava, hashta de amris kriya me'akva. If you're saying that kriya is me'akev, lefichach ilim ve'ilemes shechaltzu chalitzas and psula, it seems to be that it should be li'ikuva, the opposite inference from our first version of learning. Not only that, it must nisin kereb zera. Amar Reb zera kol aroi lebila ein bilu me'akav me'akev espo. This is a din by the korban mincha, and the din is that you don't have to mix every granule of flour with water. It just has to be ra'i labila, that the amount of water is enough to absorb, to make into a dough, all that is the flour. And the same is true here. They don't have to actually read all the words. The din is that they just have to be able to say all the words in theory, that they have the capacity for amira. That if there is a person who does rekakah, that she does spit on the ground, halach is chalitza michlal, that under these circumstances she'd be puzzle from her brothers from marrying them again. Once you do chalitza, you can't go back. Mani, who is this? Rabbi Akiva. If you want to say that this is the opinion of Rabbi Akiva, hashtu makom mitzvah. In a case of a makom mitzvah, the case which we're going to see is about the emurim. The ikal meimar midi dehave emurim. There's a mitzvah to take the emurim and put them on the mizbech. V'chileisnehu lo me'akve. When there are no emurim, it's not me'akev. V'chiisnehu me'akve. And when there are emurim to put on their ma'akev, and even so, Amar Rabbi Akiva lo me'akve doesn't even agree with that din. So then if that's true, then me'achin ifsalab, then why in our case would we say that if she does only rukaka, that if she only does the spitting, that she would then have to be puzzled from the brothers? So it can't be Rabbi Akiva. Ve'ela, says the Gemara, if you want to say the Rebbe Lazar, so let's see if that works. We have multiple factors that allow for chalitza to be functional, and here it was only rukaka, so that doesn't count. So it says the Gemara, it must be Rebbe. What does Rebbe say? The time. The Brisa writes, Kiv se'atzeres, the korbanos that are brought on Shavuos, ein mekachin halechem el b'shchita. The bread only becomes sanctified b'shchita. Ketzad, what's the din? Shachtan lishman v'zarak daman lishman kidesh halechem. If you do the shchita of the kiv se'atzeres and the zrikas adam lishman, both of them, then the lechem is considered lechem, and it's actually kodesh. Shachat shelo lishman v'zarak lishman. What if you did the shchita shelo lishman, but the zrikas adam lishman lo kidesh halechem, and shachtan lishman v'zarak daman shelo lishman kadosh ve'ino kadosh divrei Rebbe. Rebbe says that in that case, where the shchita was done lishman but the zrikas adam was not, it's kind of like a quasi in the middle. And Rabbi Lazar, Rabbi Shimon Omer, La'olamenu Kadosh Ad Sheyishchol Lishman V'Yizrok Daman Lishman. We have both of them without any hesitations. So therefore, the Shita of Yevamos Shirokaka Tachlots. So the halacha is that has to be only according to Rebbe, because it doesn't make sense according to anybody else. Rabbi Lazar has a double requirement in order to be matir, and Rebbe only has one. So therefore, if she only did the rokaka, it would still count. We're going to stop right here at the very bottom of Daf Kuf Daled Amud Beis, wishing you all a beautiful day.